I knew something was wrong the moment I unlocked my front door, and the air inside my apartment felt unfamiliar, not empty, and not hostile, just altered in a way that made my chest tighten before my mind could explain why. The smell was the first thing, a clean artificial lemon scent that I never used, layered over my own space like someone else's signature. Quiet but deliberate, and I stood there longer than I should have, with the keys still in my hand, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint noise of traffic outside, trying to convince myself that exhaustion from travel was playing tricks on me. I had just come back from a 10-day trip, a rare vacation I planned carefully, paid for myself, and did not ask anyone's opinion about, which alone had been a small act of rebellion in my family, the kind they never commented on directly but stored somewhere for later. When I stepped further inside, I saw the couch first, and immediately understood that something had shifted, because it wasn't where I left it, rotated toward the window, pushed closer to the coffee table, as if someone had decided my way of sitting was inefficient, while the rug beneath it was straightened and perfectly aligned with the edges of the room. I didn't move or breathe, because my body understood before my brain did that someone had been here. I walked slowly, the way you do when you're afraid to confirm something you already know. And the bookshelf along the wall looked lighter, airier, like it had lost weight. My bedroom door was open, even though I always closed it before leaving, and inside the closet felt wrong, too neat, like a hotel, with clothes grouped by color instead of texture, and shoes aligned in a way that looked staged, while the box under my bed with photographs, handwritten cards, and a scarf from my first real job interview was simply gone. I sat on the edge of the bed because my legs stopped working properly, my hands trembling in that delayed way that comes after shock rather than during it. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken lock, and no shattered glass, because they hadn't broken in at all. They had been invited by themselves. My phone buzzed in my hand before I realized I'd picked it up, and the message was from my Aunt Susan, saying they fixed up the place a bit while I was gone, and that I would thank them later, followed by a smiley face. Susan had always spoken to me like that, light and cheerful, confident in her own benevolence, my mother's older sister, the one everyone called practical and strong, the woman who raised 2 kids, survived a divorce, and never missed an opportunity to remind me that life required discipline. Her daughter, my cousin Emily, was worse, younger than me by 3 years, louder and sharper, always certain she was one decision ahead of everyone else, calling it being proactive, while I quietly called it meddling. They had keys because I'd given them years ago when my mother was sick, and everyone insisted it was safer if family could get in any time, and I never took them back because it felt rude, dramatic, and unnecessary. I stared at Susan's message until the words blurred, especially the part where she said fixed up. I started opening drawers, cabinets, and shelves, each discovery landing like a small controlled explosion. With the extra set of plates I rarely used gone, the old lamp I kept because it reminded me of my father gone, and half my clothes missing, anything they considered outdated, impractical, or unnecessary. I called Susan and she answered on the second ring, cheerful as always, asking if I was home already and how the trip was, while I asked her very calmly why she had been in my apartment. There was a pause, brief but telling, before the familiar tone slid into place, and she told me not to start like that they were helping me, that I'd been living like a student for years and needed a reset, while Emily's voice chimed in the background, loud enough to hear without speaker, saying they donated the junk and that I had so much stuff I never even used. My throat tightened at the word donated, but my voice stayed even and almost detached as I said they went through my things. Susan sighed the way adults do when they think a child is being unreasonable, telling me they did me a favor and that I was too emotional about objects. I didn't argue, raise my voice, or tell them how invasive it felt, how violated I felt, or how my chest still hurt like something precious had been quietly stolen. And instead, I said okay, and thanked them for helping. Susan sounded relieved and almost triumphant, as if she'd passed some invisible test, telling me she knew I'd come around. After the call ended, I sat alone in my rearranged living room, surrounded by a version of my life, edited by someone else's standards, and something inside me settled, cold and precise, because this would not be loud or messy. It would be exact. I knew things about Susan and Emily that they forgot I knew, including schedules, routines, and access points, the kind of details you absorb over years of family closeness, along with which boundaries they assumed were unbreakable. Susan had always said family shouldn't need permission, and I wondered if she still believed that when the roles were reversed. Over the next few weeks, I behaved exactly as expected, answering messages politely, showing up to family dinners, letting Emily talk over me and Susan correct my life choices in front of everyone, while I smiled and planned. Susan owned a rental property she rarely visited, a small townhouse she managed remotely and proudly talked about as proof of her financial intelligence, while Emily handled some of the logistics and proudly emphasized how responsible she was. They had given me access months earlier when Susan went on a cruise and wanted someone nearby just in case, and I had never used it because I never needed to, until now. I waited because timing mattered and emotion had to cool completely, and when the moment came, it felt almost boring in its clarity. I didn't rush or sneak. I scheduled everything, contacted the property management company Susan used, confirmed my authority as an emergency contact, which she herself had set up, reviewed donation guidelines, disposal rules, and legal parameters, and documented everything carefully. When I entered the townhouse, I felt the same unfamiliar stillness I'd felt in my own apartment weeks earlier, and I moved slowly and deliberately, making decisions based not on sentiment, but on usefulness, efficiency, and improvement. I rearranged furniture for better flow, removed items that were outdated or unnecessary, boxed things that felt excessive, scheduled a donation pickup, and left notes that were helpful and clear, saying we reorganized the space to make it more functional, and that she would appreciate it once she got used to it. When Susan walked into that townhouse days later, the shock on her face was immediate, raw, and unfiltered. Emily called me first, her voice sharp with disbelief, asking what I had done, while I listened quietly and calmly before telling her I did the same thing they did for me. There was silence on the line, heavy and unsteady, until Emily finally said I had no right. And I almost laughed as I told her I had every right she assumed she had. Susan didn't call that day or the next, and when she finally did, her voice was different, smaller and careful, telling me we needed to talk. And I agreed, not to apologize, but to finish the conversation they started. We met a week later in a quiet cafe near Susan's house. Not a place filled with emotion or memory, just neutral territory where voices stayed low, and people minded their own business. And I arrived early because I wanted to be calm before they walked in. Susan came first, her posture stiff and controlled, the way it always was when she felt wronged, but hadn't yet decided how to frame it. And Emily followed a few minutes later with her jaw set tight, eyes sharp, already ready to argue even before a word was spoken. No one hugged me. No one asked how I was. Susan folded her hands on the table and looked at me for a long moment, as if she was trying to recognize someone unfamiliar wearing my face. "What you did was inappropriate," she said finally, choosing the word carefully, as if legality and emotion were two separate things she could sort through later. I nodded slowly and said that was interesting, because those were the exact words I'd been looking for when I came home from my trip. Emily leaned forward immediately, her voice tense and quick, saying this was different, that their intentions had been good, that they were helping me, while I had acted out of spite. I didn't interrupt her. I let her finish, because I wanted them to hear themselves. When she stopped, I asked Emily to explain how intention changed the fact that they entered my home without permission, touched my belongings, decided what parts of my life were worth keeping, and removed the rest without asking. Susan shifted in her seat and said they were family, that it wasn't the same as a stranger, that family steps in when someone is making poor choices. I asked her quietly who had decided my choices were poor. There was a pause long enough to notice the clink of cups behind the counter, the low murmur of another table, the sound of a spoon hitting porcelain. Susan said she had because she was older and had lived more life. I told her that was exactly the problem. For years they had spoken to me like someone temporarily unfinished, someone who would eventually grow into the version of myself they already approved of. And until then they treated my boundaries as suggestions rather than rules. Emily scoffed and said I was being dramatic, that no one was hurt, that I could buy new things, that objects weren't that important. I looked at her and asked if she'd felt that way when she walked into the townhouse and saw her own decisions undone. Her mouth opened, then closed. Susan's eyes flickered toward Emily for a brief moment, and in that silence, I could feel something uncomfortable settling between them, something they hadn't considered before, the realization that this wasn't about furniture or donations at all. I told them I hadn't broken any rules. I hadn't damaged anything. I hadn't taken a single item for myself, and I had operated entirely within the access and authority they themselves had given me, which meant the only difference between what I did and what they did was that they didn't like being on the receiving end. Susan said it felt violating. I nodded and said yes, that was the word I'd been looking for too. Emily asked if this was my revenge, her tone sharp but uncertain now, and I told her it wasn't revenge, because revenge is emotional and messy, and this had been calm, deliberate, and precise. I told them this was a boundary. Susan stared at her hands for a long moment before asking what I wanted now. The question surprised me, because it was the first time either of them had asked instead of assumed. I told her I wanted my keys back, all copies, and I wanted my home to be my space again, untouched unless I explicitly invited someone in, and I wanted their opinions about my life to stay exactly where they belonged, unspoken unless I asked. Emily let out a short breath and said I was overreacting again. Susan didn't agree with her this time. She nodded slowly, as if replaying the moment she walked into that townhouse over and over in her head, feeling the same tightness I had felt weeks earlier when I smelled lemon cleaner in my own apartment. "You could have just told us how you felt," she said quietly. I looked at her and said I had been telling them for years, just not loudly enough to make them listen. We sat there a little longer, the conversation winding down not with resolution or warmth, but with something colder and more honest, an understanding built not on apology, but on consequence. When we stood to leave, Susan handed me the keys without a word, and Emily avoided my eyes. They never brought up my apartment again. They never rearranged another room in my life, never offered unsolicited advice disguised as concern, never stepped into my space without permission. Family dinners became quieter, more distant, and strangely easier to breathe through. They stopped treating me like a project, and I stopped pretending that silence was the same thing as peace.